Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. My name is Micah. This is Winston. As always, we're just going to dive right into it. This is the Yom Kippur War, 1973 to the Sinai Front. Let's go.
Peace in the Middle East would not last in the aftermath of Israel's decisive victory in 1967, and the continued hostilities would lead to the Yom Kippur War of 1973, a conflict which would have global implications for decades to come. Welcome to our first video on the 1973 Arab-Israeli War and the Sinai clash with Egypt. If you're interested in the history of this era, don't forget to check out our second channel, The Cold War. The link is in the top right corner. In the aftermath of the Six-Day War, victorious Israeli forces began to construct fortifications along the Suez Canal in order to protect Sinai. Known as the Bar-Lev Line, it stretched around 100 miles from the Gulf of Suez in the south.
Okay, so I'm not gonna lie. I'm not 100% sure on everything that happened during the during the whole Israeli war and all that stuff. I know that Israeli forces were able to capture the Suez Canal. I know that different things like that. I know that they pretty much dominated a lot during pretty much the whole time, if I'm not mistaken. I could be wrong, but these are like the little small things I know. Like I'm not gonna like this is like one of the few wars I really don't know that much about. So I'm definitely excited to learn more. So let's see.
South to the Mediterranean in the north. Along the line were 30 strategically placed strongpoints known as Mausim, each screened by a sandbank several meters high. To the east of the canal, two roads, the artillery road and the lateral road, permitted easy transport of forces throughout the front. The Egyptians responded to this construction by launching sustained artillery strikes on the new Israeli positions and sending commando raids into Israel, beginning the so-called War of Attrition. Israel responded with its own commando operations and an airborne offensive directed at the Egyptian air defense system. An assault.
And you know what's crazy too? Because you remember like I want to say what was it, like a few months ago, if not like a year ago, where that freaking that ship got stuck in the Suez Canal and just it locked up everything. They were talking about if they couldn't get stuck, you know what I'm saying, in a few more days or weeks or whatever, that like it was pretty much going to start some catastrophic stuff, and how they were losing like millions of dollars a day and all that stuff. So can you imagine, like, I'm sure there's charts and stuff like that of how much was lost during this time, but like just the fact that they had to close down this entire shipment area, this very vital freaking little passageway that pretty much connects Asia to Europe essentially. And yeah, that's insane to think about, but yeah.
Designed to pressure Egypt into accepting a ceasefire. President Nasser realized the threat of Israeli air superiority had to be solved, and flew to Moscow to obtain more advanced SA-2 and SA-3 surface-to-air missiles, technicians and combat pilots from the Soviets. August 7, 1970 saw a 6-month ceasefire brokered by the US, preserving the status quo in the region. The War of Attrition had drained Israeli morale and proved that the Israeli Air Force could be countered. Nasser wouldn't live to see the results, as he died on September 28, 1970, and was succeeded by Anwar Sadat. Sadat signed a 15-year treaty of friendship with the Soviets and tried to make peace with Israel, asking them to redeploy the IDF 32 kilometers east of the Suez Canal, beyond the strategic passes. The Israelis refused, and Sadat settled on a war as the only option left by May 1971. Though the Soviets continued to ship armaments to Egypt, including numerous Scud missiles, the hesitance of Brezhnev to support Egypt, and relatively warmer relations between the USSR and US in this period, resulted in the eventual expulsion of Soviet personnel from Egypt by mid-1972. Sadat then turned to Syria's president, Hafez al-Assad, and persuaded him that the lands lost in 1967 should be returned. Pledges of financial aid from oil-rich Saudi Arabia and Qatar were secured, along with promises of troops and aircraft from the Saudis, Algeria, Libya, Morocco, Sudan and Iraq, though most of these contingents wouldn't arrive in time. Sadat was realistic and knew that his army wouldn't be able to utterly defeat the IDF in the field, and so wanted a limited war instead. He and his allies would launch a surprise attack across the Suez Canal and Golan Heights, break Israel's myth of invincibility, and use diplomatic pressure to secure a favourable peace. The Yom Kippur War was preceded by events on each front which adversely affected Israeli perceptions of the military situation. On September 7, 1973, Syrian fighters were scrambled to intercept an Israeli reconnaissance aircraft, and a battle developed 200 kilometers northwest of Israel over the Mediterranean. The dogfight, which resulted in 13 downed Syrian planes and no Israeli aircraft, allowed the Syrians to concentrate its forces on the Golan Heights without suspicion. They appeared to just be showing force after the aerial skirmish. In the south, Egyptian armies concentrated their forces along the Suez Canal under the cover of a training exercise. The image of normalcy was also maintained in an attempt to deceive the IDF. Soldiers walked along the canal without wearing helmets, they continued to fish in the canal, and false criticisms of Egyptian-used Soviet equipment were planted in Cairo newspapers. Nevertheless, IDF observations still noticed unusual amounts of military activity in the area. When this situation was discussed by Israeli High Command on September 30th, Intelligence Chief Major General Eli Zaira assured the government that the probability of war...
Yeah, I mean, obviously, from what we've seen from freaking the recent military action going on in Europe, I mean, you saw what Russia did whenever right before they started up, they did a huge buildup of personnel on the front. I think they were even making it seem like they weren't even about to do anything, and they just did it. Like, lying to their own personnel, talking about it's a training exercise and stuff like that. But, I mean, who knows? Like, I'm just saying, like, maybe they did the same thing, like, lying to their people, but I'm sure they probably didn't, obviously, because there has to be a certain amount of, I don't know, knowing, but probably not. Who knows? I don't know.
Was low. After details of the Egyptian offensive, known as Operation Badr, were received at 0400 hours on the morning of October 6th, preparations began for mobilization, but it was far too late. Just before 2 p.m. on Yom Kippur, the holiest day in Judaism's calendar, more than 200 Egyptian aircraft flew low over the Suez Canals, launching strikes on Israeli Hawk surface-to-air missile batteries, airfields, command posts, and other infrastructure in Sinai. The attacks were successful, but Egypt lost 40 aircraft to air combat and ground. At the same time, 2 Tu-16 bombers flew over the Mediterranean and launched AS-5 Kelt missiles at Tel Aviv to show the Israelis any attempt at strategic bombing would be met in kind. In Sinai, 14 more Tupolev bombers successfully attacked targets in the Sinai Desert. The bombardment on land began at the same time, as over 2,000 artillery pieces, including howitzers, heavy mortars, and even Katyusha rocket launchers, began to hammer the Bar-Lev line.
Yeah, I mean, from looking at this, it kind of makes it more obvious to see why Israeli opted for, you know what I'm saying, I think the air defense that they have now, which is insane. I think it's like one of the best in the world now. But, I mean, it's obvious to see why, because... I mean, does Israeli have a pretty solid air force? Because I'm legit asking because I've never heard of it, so that's what I'm asking. So let's see.
Supplemented by specially placed tanks atop the sand ramparts. During the first minute of Operation Badr, it's estimated that around 10,500 shells hit the first line of Israeli defense. Shortly after the bombardment began, specialized Egyptian tank hunter squadrons, armed with RPGs and Malyutka anti-tank missiles, crossed the Suez Canal and occupied ambush positions at pre-planned Israeli tank emplacements. Behind them were 2 Egyptian armies. The second was in the north, commanded by Major General Ma'amun, and the third was to the south, led by Major General Wassel. Together they were composed of 5 infantry, 2 armoured and 3 mechanized divisions, along with a number of independent brigades. The infantry formations especially possessed units with massive quantities of anti-tank weaponry, designed to counter Israeli armour-heavy assaults. Assaults across the entire front began in waves at 2:40 p.m, and the engineering corps breached the high sandbanks by utilizing high-pressure water hoses. At the same time, deployment of Soviet-made folding bridges began in order to facilitate the crossing of Egyptian armor and artillery. Over the coming days, Israeli Air Force jets would be bogged down constantly attacking these bridges, suffering massive losses from the Egyptian air defense umbrella in the process. In essence, the Israelis' greatest weapon was made virtually useless. The waves of infantry pushed several kilometers inland and established a defensive front, while specially trained units dealt with the Mauzim strongpoints, which were gradually captured or surrendered. Along almost the entire line, IDF armoured columns instinctively rushed to the front in order to relieve the strongpoints, but were badly mauled and repulsed by the aforementioned anti-tank squadrons lurking in ambush. Israeli headquarters was in utter confusion at the startling Egyptian success, and by dawn faced tens of thousands of enemy soldiers.
Yeah, but it kind of sucks that the columns were kind of slower compared to what they probably should have been. Like, it feels like they should have been able to get there like as soon as the first men were crossing over to like start blowing up bridges and all that stuff. But I don't know. I'm sure there was like actual reasons as to why they didn't show up as until the pretty much everybody was already across already. But
hundreds of tanks and vast quantities of both land and anti-aircraft artillery batteries, as well as SAM sites on the eastern bank. On the 8th, an armoured IDF counterattack by 2 tank divisions was launched under Major Generals Avraham Adan and Ariel Sharon, but was again repulsed with devastating losses at the hands of artillery fire and anti-tank infantry. Although fierce fighting continued after the assault, the IDF managed to stabilize the Sinai Front by October 9th, with Ariel Sharon's armored division intelligently maneuvering and destroying 50 Egyptian tanks a day later. Sadat's armies had achieved their limited objective and had repulsed an Israeli counterattack with massive losses, but pressure on the similarly active Syrian front on the Golan Heights necessitated a further Egyptian offensive to relieve it, as Israel had concentrated its forces there. The IDF High Command had been paralyzed with indecision before this point, but knowledge of this upcoming Egyptian attack made the course of action very clear: block it, crush it, and counterattack. On October 14th, hundreds of heavy guns opened up along the artillery road, while fighter bombers attacked Israeli ground targets in preparation for the attack. In the northern sector, the Egyptian 18th Infantry Division and a brigade of T-62 tanks attacked from Al-Kantara to Ramali. Here, Adan's division threw the Egyptians back to their origin point, destroying at least 50 tanks. In the center, Ariel Sharon's division bore the brunt of the 21st Armored Division's assault leading from Ismailia, which met similar punishment to its northern counterpart. In this fighting, the 14th Armored Brigade destroyed 93 tanks of the Egyptian 1st Armored Brigade, essentially destroying it as a fighting unit. South of Sharon, an Egyptian armored thrust by the 4th Armored Division.
Yeah, and I'm obviously guessing that the Israelis have the better tanks and the better weapon systems and guns and all that other stuff. So, if I'm not mistaken, like I'm pretty sure like they had the more advanced stuff, but probably not though. Who knows though? Because I mean, if Russia, I don't know, if they're getting their stuff from Russia, the Egyptians. I don't know, so I feel like they're probably giving them probably some old stuff, you know what I'm saying, so who knows.
And 3rd Armoured Brigade was aimed at the Gidi and Midla passes, only to be turned back at the cost of 60 tanks, and was almost totally annihilated by the IAF. The Egyptians were advancing and lost their anti-air umbrella, leaving them dangerously vulnerable to air attack. Further south, an Egyptian task force consisting of an infantry and tank brigade attacked towards Ras Sidar along the Gulf of Suez, but was repulsed with ease by Major General Yeshaya Gavish. The attacks turned into a massive armoured battle. In just 2 hours, the catastrophic Egyptian offensive had been decisively defeated. Of the 400 tanks committed to it, 260 had been destroyed, and the way was clear for a massive Israeli counterattack. They had lost just 20 vehicles. The tide of the war had shifted, and the Egyptians were hemmed back into their beachheads. The Israelis now favoured the idea of crossing the Suez Canal and forcing Egypt into a ceasefire, something which was made increasingly plausible because of US aid in the form of Operation Nickelgrass. A broadly outlined plan named...
It's crazy how the Egyptians had the initiative. They literally had the whole entire new freaking front on the other side of the canal and everything. Had the ability to get their entire army, aside from their artillery, which doesn't need to move anyway, over to the other side of the freaking canal, and they still weren't able to, do anything with it. And I mean, it looks like it could be attuned to just the fact that they were, committing these like little amounts of troops when they could have been, maybe taking advantage of the fact that they have more troops. Understand that the Israeli probably has better equipment, but it looks like they obviously have more, bigger army. So why not take advantage of that? But
Stone-Hearted Man, or Operation Gazelle, had been drawn up before the war for this very scenario. After it was tuned for the situation, it called for laying 2 bridges across the canal near Fort Matsmed, a location which was in a mile-wide gap between the Egyptian 2nd and 3rd armies. When this was done and the Israelis had crossed, they should capture a 50-mile-wide area between Mount Attaka and the outskirts of Ismailia before preparing for a thrust on Cairo. The operation's main thrust would be conducted by the Maverick tank commander Ariel Sharon's 143rd Division, which, at 1600 hours on the 15th of October, began its attack. Tuvia Reviv's 600th Reserve Armoured Brigade was sent out on a frontal diversionary assault along the Tassa Ismailia Road, while Amnon Reshev's 14th Brigade approached the Tirto Lexicon Crossroad. From this point, sections of his force began experiencing fire at the hands of stubborn Egyptian defenders who were stalwartly entrenched at an agricultural facility known as the Chinese Farm, just north of the planned corridor to the canal. Israeli armoured columns attacking from the front, flanks and rear managed to decisively clear the Akavish Road, allowing a parachute brigade, commanded by Colonel Danny Matt, and some bridging equipment to get through. But stubborn enemy resistance soon closed the road.
yeah, I was about to say the smartest thing the Egyptians can do at this point is just entrench themselves hard, like in deep, and so that way they at least don't lose their that part of the canal. At least they can have the canal to themselves. You know what I'm saying? And that way they can start also moving the the Israelis back to their actual normal borders instead of their bloated out borders that we see now. But let's see.
Behind Reshev's unit. The secondary Tirta road remained totally blocked by Egyptian defenders, and Israeli logistics began to have problems. As a brutal, confused night engagement began at the Chinese farm, Ariel Sharon ordered his parachutists to cross the channel in boats, which they did by 2:40 AM on the 16th, having been delayed by logistical gridlock on the only open road. By 8 AM, Matt's bridgehead stretched 3 miles north of the Great Bitter Lake, catching some Egyptians on the other bank by surprise, and securing some more canal crossings in the process. This assisted in ferrying more tanks over to the bridgehead, with which the Israeli spearhead began to launch raids west to destroy Egyptian SAM sites and punch holes into the enemy's air defense web. Egypt's high command was not overly concerned about the crossing, but ordered a counterattack to snap the IDF corridor shut nonetheless. It would be conducted in the north by the 21st Armoured Division, attacking from the Chinese farm, and in the south by the 25th Armoured Brigade, moving up the lakeshore. So on the morning of October 17th, Egypt's pincer was launched, but the Israelis already knew they were coming. In the north, 3 concentrated IDF armoured brigades blunted and smashed the Egyptian attackers, who withdrew after suffering heavy casualties. Near the Great Bitter Lake, Colonel Reshev's armour managed to ambush and encircle the Egyptian 25th, pushing it against the water before annihilating it with intense artillery and tank fire. By 5:30 PM the same day, 85 of 96 enemy T-62s had been destroyed and the counterattack repelled. By the 19th.
Yeah, the only thing I can really think of is these guys just really did not have the proper, like, they were probably, I'm sure it's super easy to look up, and I will look it up after this video, but I'm sure it's like one of those things where they just had like World War II or, you know, weapons going up against like, you know, 1973 freaking weapons, you know what I'm saying, like actual weapons from the era, and it just was not competing. Especially, it really looks like with their tanks. Their tanks are just like on a whole nother level. Cause it looks like they've even barely lost any in like every single one of Egypt's freaking tanks that they come into contact with are just, you know, one by one gone, gone, gone. So crazy to look at.
Of October, even the battle at the Chinese farm had come to an end when Reshef attacked the exhausted defenders, conclusively pushing them north after heroic resistance. Across the Suez, additional bridges were slowly brought to bear as the hours passed, including a monstrous prefabricated roller bridge which had been painstakingly towed from miles away by more than a dozen tanks. This increase in crossing points allowed multiple armoured brigades to more efficiently reinforce the bridgehead, known now as the agricultural buffer due to the farms and irrigation canals in the area. Israeli armour also began to mass for a breakout. Egypt's high command had decisively underestimated the so-called television operation that crossing the canal represented. It was instead a serious strategic threat. At dawn on October 18th, 3 IDF brigades under Major General Ariel Sharon, Brigadier General Kalman Magan, and Major General Avraham Aden burst out of the bridgehead from all angles, pushing northwest, west, and south respectively. By this point in the war, IAF jets were increasingly launching lethal support missions as the Egyptian SAM sites were hunted by ground troops in the desert.
Yeah, again, when that first freaking tank, freaking brigade and the freaking first infantry brigade crossed over, they should have freaking like concentrated freaking artillery fire, all that stuff right there. Like that shouldn't even been an option because again, their equipment is just so. It seems like it's just so much better. Because I don't see any reason else why they're just getting annihilated like this. It's almost like they're just like freaking on arcade mode or something, you know what I'm saying? It's just crazy looking at, but you know.
While Sharon's northern thrust up the Sweetwater Canal towards Ismailia was slow going and met with dogged resistance, the forces under Aden and Magan smashed through hostile lines with relative ease. By midday on October 21st, Egypt's Third Army in the southern sector was cut off from its rear lines. The great powers were now beginning to take note, and neither the Soviets nor the Americans wanted a major war to break out. Secretary of State Henry Kissinger and Soviet Premier Leonid Brezhnev eventually reached ceasefire terms under UN Security Council Resolution 338, which was set to go into effect at 6 p.m. on the 22nd. Hostilities came to a halt in the north relatively smoothly, with Sharon capturing a series of bridges on the Ismailia-Suez road before it did. In the south, however, it took until the 25th for a solid peace to be achieved, by which time Aden had reached the port of Suez. While the war's hostilities officially came to an end, skirmishes continued unofficially for months. Though final military victory had gone to Israel, its government and population were shocked by early Egyptian successes. The so-called Agranat Commission, an Israeli governmental body appointed to discover the failures which led to these defeats, eventually led to the end of multiple political careers, including that of Moshe Dayan and Golda Meir, in addition to many more military figures. To the Egyptians, Anwar Sadat had gained a famous victory rather than a defeat, and his armed forces could hold their heads high in the knowledge that their crossing of the canal on Yom Kippur had been a maneuver of great skill and bravery. War Thunder had...
Alright guys, we'll go ahead and end it right there. So yeah, I mean, honestly it's a little bit, some people might think I'm a little crazy, but it's a little bit reminiscent of the Winter War, where one side that's like super, you know, has a really big army in numbers and stuff like that is just not, and is going up against an army with like super fewer numbers, but for some reason they're just not being able to, you know what I'm saying, get it done. And in multiple ways they're like, you know what I'm saying. But obviously, early on in this war, Egypt had some success and stuff like that. But I don't know, it's just crazy that they couldn't capitalize on that crossing like that, like they could have. You know what I'm saying? 'Cause that was a they could have done so much more with that, especially with the fact that Israel wasn't even like didn't even get up to like catch up to it. You know what I'm saying, until like a little bit later. But in case though, if you guys like the video, don't forget to like, comment, subscribe. I'll see you guys in another one. I'm out.